All right, folks, I think we'll get started. Welcome to our restart of the GIS Professional Programs Coffee Hour Talk. This was something that we had started originally with the programs as a way to have an alternative track that from our EFU lecture series, more focused on professional development for our online accelerated masters and our cartography and GIS master's students in person. In doing that, we want to invite in technicians who are kind of at the lead of industry. We want to bring alumni, and so hopefully everyone in this room someday will give a video talk that we'll archive to just talk about what we're missing in the program, what you've learned since, to share back. We want to invite the lecturers and the staff and faculty that contribute to the program, and so I think we want to have a balance. We also want to bring in faculty who are leading labs and have led other GIS programs, like our speaker today, who've been part of other GIS programs, to share a rounder perspective. And always to connect it to the kind of coursework that you're doing through the GIS professional programs here at UW. And so I'm happy to have my dear colleague, Francis Harvey, be the person to help restart this. It's been a few years. So he's in some ways our guinea pig, being friendly, and we'll give feedback as well. Francis currently is a professor at in the Leibniz Institute at Leipzig University in Germany, a very famous historic institute. Come on in for those that are here. He also has an appointment in the University of Warsaw in Poland with the history department. And so always, in my opinion, a very eclectic thinker. He's a world traveler, and folks that are around the US probably know him as a professor when he was at either Minnesota or Kentucky. We have a lot of connections with both of those universities. And Francis was even a student here, and I don't want to date you, but sometime a while ago in the 80s. And so we had a nice walk today that we were kind of looking at the differences in the structures of the way the university is laid out over the last 30 years. I also am a student of the program, and so I always love to hear all sorts of student perspectives. Francis has published a variety of articles, book chapters, books, proceedings papers, and I really admire how they're at the intersection of kind of geographic thought, cartographic design, and so there's always a technical element to his work, but also critical theory. And I think Francis is probably known most for the types of topics we introduce in Geography 572 around historical cartography, critical cartography, and thinking about sort of new media and looking forward and always looking back. And I think there's going to be some combinations of that in this lecture. And I know Francis through the International Cartographic Association, where he's been heavily involved in the Atlas Commission. The ICA is set up around special topics, around commissions. I currently lead the User Experience Commission, and there's just a lot of great productive conversations that our commissions have had throughout the years and in different places around the globe, which is always really fun. So without further ado, it's a hot room. Although everyone that's currently in the room, I know it's being recorded, everyone's gone to the air conditioner, which is very smart. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Francis Harvey.
Thanks so much, Rob. Thanks for the invitation and the start. I'm really glad I'm not here for a job talk. Yeah, I was going to ask. Yeah, and so I haven't been to Madison for some years. I've passed through a number of times, but indeed it was really great to have some time with Rob, and he also invited me to coffee. Thank you for that. And give me a chance to get a sense of a little bit from the outside of what's changing. But I just think that for all the changes you see happen outside of a place, there's always going to be things that stay the same in the questions we're dealing with. And what I wanted to talk today is not so much going to be something that people are doing now, that people are going, oh, that's a different way to do it. But it's going to be more looking at things from the past and asking if we've not missed something from the past and trying to suggest that maybe by looking again, at some concepts from the past. I'll focus primarily on a topic that's well known here, interaction, and so that we can find some new ways and ways to improve our work. So there's a theoretical side, as Rob was elegantly describing my work, but there's also a practical side to this. And I don't think you need to be theoretical to be practical, but having a little sense of the theory can help be better practical. And that's what I think so often in what we do, theory should be about. So the title of the talk is sort of the direction I'm headed, but I'm going to say right away, you might be surprised in the direction I take up in this. And that has much to do with where I am primarily these days at the University of Warsaw in the History Department, working on digital humanities project, particularly as I'll call it, spatial humanities. So just from the beginning, I just wanted to show you the outside-in world so you can imagine it while we're talking here. This was built up in the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1943 for an exhibit. And this was a centerpiece of the exhibit where viewers, people who went to see the exhibit, would enter into the globe. And I'll show a few more pictures of it later on. But I think you can see already something with interaction has to happen here. And they're actually doing this outside in, or particularly Herbert Bayer, who I'll talk briefly about, who was behind the exhibit, to give people a different perspective on things. And that is so often something that we do in cartography, and I think therefore it's helpful to consider this. So I split the talk into two parts because each part is quite different. And I wanted to just say right away that the first part's going to be mainly about the outside-in globe and interactions. The second part's going to be more spatial humanities, as I've mentioned, where I'll talk briefly about interactions, but more in a conceptual way, because that's work that we've really just started to focus on in the last 6 months. And we haven't gotten to the point where we have a lot to show as results from it, but I can explain the ideas, and maybe you have some ideas that I would be happy to hear from you to take with to help us develop that. So let's get into section 1. And as I mentioned, I want to focus on interactions, but not in the sense that most of us are now thinking about human-computer interactions, but in a more traditional sense of reading, basically. And not just simply the complexity, the cognitive activities of reading, but that it's a bridge between our mental capacities and society, between our cultural understanding of the world. And that's so often what cartography does. Here, my atlas for the 3-year-old girl reading this atlas, who's trying to gaining a first understanding of the relationships in the world, of her relationship to the world, of members of her family, of friends of the family who've traveled, of people she's maybe met in at preschool. All these things are being connected in this atlas between her experiences in the world with the age of 3 perhaps, and the documents and the materials that are being presented. And this is so crucial to what atlases are about, is discovery and finding these relationships in the world. It's about an interaction that goes beyond the cognitive activity of reading, but is richer and is about us finding our place and our places and different perspectives in the human cultural sense of the world. In graphic design, I'm going to jump here to an example that I just found absolutely fantastic from Italy from 1929. You'll see a lot of my examples are from the late 1920s, where an Italian artist and other artists were working on the question of multiple perspectives, the problems that scientific discoveries from the late 19th century had opened up, that psychology had opened up, of thinking about, well, there's different ways to present things in the world, and there's different ways that people interact with it. So there's not only the multiple ways for the artist that would be emphasized in art history, but there's also different ways that readers or viewers experience that, and how they make relationships between that we can evoke through graphic middle is German, means is English. Sorry, if I switch into German, please stop me. Okay. Herbert Bayer was trained during this period, and he was a phenomenal designer. He was at Bauhaus first as a student, and then he taught there for some years. He's very integrative. Capabilities allowed him to go on and to do another things. He's one of the people that's associated also with creating land art for the work he was doing in Aspen later on with the Aspen Institute. He's also very famous for his typographical work. Some circles he's most famous for that among designers, but also for information design. And this includes World Geo with the hyphen graphic atlas, which is a very interesting atlas to look at in terms of information design and in terms of interaction for what he was doing and how he ties in not just these multiple perspectives that I showed you a moment ago, but also the idea that you need a new way to engage people in exhibits that they were working on in the 1920s. This goes back to the Russian constructivists, but I could do a whole art history lecture about this, but I want to focus on the practical side more in this and say that this integration was really crucial for the concepts that they were developing, but the different styles, the different ways of conceiving the relationship between the graphic means of communication and the perception of the material was what was rapidly evolving in the 1920s. Oskar Schlemmer, who is also at Bauhaus, who's perhaps best known for the iconic painting of the staircase in Bauhaus, tried in a class that he taught in 1928 that his notes were posthumously published in 1969 to show how everything comes together around the human and the human's interactions with the world. There's a lot of examples that I could go into, and there's much more depth here, but it's important, I just think, to make a point here, and that is to say that interaction isn't just the way we are able to interact with computing devices now, but interactions has always been about tools, machines, and what did I leave out there? Humans. It's always going to be about interactions with other people and in a culture, and that's what's going to make it possible to develop a cultural understanding of the world through these multiple layers, as Schlemmer is trying to outline there. And I know Rob's going, I know German, I can read this all. And you can make all these associations to deepen your understanding of what we're able to communicate when we're working on graphic design. This is what Herbert Bayer then took up as when he came to the US in 1938. And as you can see up in the top right, there is a better image of what the outside-in globe looked like in the exhibit hall, and below a picture from during its being assembled and built by the team of people that had to do this then. And that's practically a huge difference to how we do things now. Now, if we want to do something like that, you might want to get some specialists to help you with some programming issues, but you don't have to assemble all the graphic specialists that they required back then to be able to do this, and organize the printing and specialized printing shops, and have painters that could do the painting of the texts in the exhibit. It was a very complicated activity that they had to do then that now has become much simpler, but it's interaction. It's embodied interaction in this example from 1943. It's less embodied now, but there's still, whether I'm holding an atlas in front of me or you, or we're looking at a computer screen, or there is always a relationship between the body and what's being shown. And this was the starting point for me thinking about, well, they're showing this Russian constructivists are really breaking with the past, but you're still interacting. But they're emphasizing the interactions in a much more vibrant way. And Bayer is interesting because Bayer was also trying to teach this material at that time. So he couldn't just say, oh, I'm just going to do it, like he later went on and did. But there's some reflective essays from him. But he had to actually say, okay, what is this? How does this work? What are we trying to do? And in putting the exhibit together in its complexity, he's using a lot of concepts for exhibition design that had been developed in the 1920s and were still probably very significant, although you can look at the literature on exhibition design now and you can see they've moved obviously way further than what was done there. But in an exhibit like Airways to Peace, it's not only that you have the outside-in globe, you also have this really neat way of letting people experience aerial photography for the first time by in the lower right, not the lowest most image, but above it on that page in the lower right, there's a bridge in the exhibit that's built in. So when you walk across the bridge, you look down and then you see the aerial photography underneath. So you get an idea of what it means to have the bird's eye perspective now thanks to aerial imagery and how the world is changing. In the middle of the war, this is already pointing to the future beyond the war where aerial transportation, aviation is going to change the way the world is, which we now have experienced after so many decades. But they're looking at this and they're saying, we need new ways to represent it. And the traditional projection isn't sufficient. We need new perspectives. And this is where the outside-in globe plays a role culturally in helping configure people's ways of thinking about the world to say, it doesn't always have to be just the map on the projected using the Mercator projection as you see on the one page of the exhibit catalog, but it also involves this complexity of changing how we opening up different perspectives and new perspectives. Again, that's, the exhibit that's, I think, an important touchstone to consider when we look at the history of interaction and how it's relevant today for us even. So, but remember I said it goes back to the 1920s. And the man with the eye here, he's from 1928. And this is a sketch that Bayer did to explain his concept for an exhibit that was in Paris in 1928 that extends the space from, instead of having just the vertical walls to exhibit on, he's saying we have to open it up. And he writes a little bit about this in his catalog and introduce these angular spaces that will produce a dynamics as well. And with these dynamics, we'll be able to have richer, more evocative engagements. And they don't talk about interactions at that point. It's about getting people into it. And whereas before, it's just about putting your stuff into the exhibit hall in the little space you got and making it talking to people when they come through. This is where a change is starting to happen and how people are thinking about exhibit design. Where that leads to, and I think, and I'm going to end on this point, and I apologize because in a PDF, you can't do all the dynamic builds on the slide, so you're seeing it all assembled there is what these images from multiple pages of the World Geographic Atlas from 1953. And I just have an example from Missouri, and below it is Central Europe, but we're going to leave that out. If you look at that example, you'll see it's turned sideways, and on the opposite page, you have a almost traditional, I call them Rand McNally style map of the United States. But if you look on the page where there's a mixture of graphs and text, you see some interesting things are going on with the choropleth map. They're using isotype symbols to show things. They're using aerial percentages as rates, ratios on the bottom here and in the middle. They're showing various figures. They're showing a major crop of the area, which I don't remember what it is. But it's not just isolated, it's in the text. And doing this in the text and having the reader have a sort of a grid-like layout already in 1953, which they had espoused many years before in the modernist design circles, but then breaking it from time to time is a way of getting the reader to interact differently with the material and to see that there's a crop. And this crop is related to the text, and this crop is related to the place. And it allows these, in an intellectual sense, more than a visual, through the visual perception of the interactions, you get a sense of the more complex interactions in the place geographically. And this is done in various ways throughout. My favorite example is Puerto Rico, but I couldn't find it when I was preparing for this talk, because there he has, crops from Puerto Rico, sugarcane, rum, tobacco, and they're all integrated, and you have the bizarre construction of the hand of the man holding the lit cigar going through the bottle of rum. And it looks bizarre, but it so stresses these interactions among products, among culture, and allows a person to look at this imagery and to make the associations that can be deepened through the text, can be deepened through the isographic graphs, and through the choropleth maps. So what I want to say is they take interaction from the Russian constructivists to this physical embodied experience of an exhibit, and they turn the atlas into an exhibition. And with that concept, Bayer is really able to create something that's very evocative. And in fact, people who work in the area of Gaia research and that often point back to this atlas as what opened their eyes to new ways of seeing the world. For information designers, it's obviously also important. Okay, part 1 ends. Any questions so far? Or do we just want to rotate one chair to get you out of the cold seat? Okay. No? Okay, then I'll just keep going then, and when we get at the end, we'll have time to go through questions for this part 2. So, as I talked about, this is about new ways of thinking about mobilities. But in doing work with old maps, we're just calling them old maps. They're not historic maps because contemporary maps can also be talking about historic events. So they're just old maps. We're trying to understand better how people use them, because if you talk to a lot of people in history, they don't have a rich conceptualization, I'll say a bit derogatory, but I think it's fair, of what the complexity of maps. They know that they're very complex, but they don't understand it and they don't engage with it. They're text oriented in their work. So this is about trying to work and develop approaches for historians that will help them understand how generalization has changed the old maps that they're working with. This is for the spatial humanities, so we always have to start out explaining what scale is. And I'm just going to go through the slides that we recently used for a presentation to people in the digital humanities, because it might be an interesting way to see a different way of thinking about scale. I know it's a challenge for my cartography colleagues in Europe to look at it this way, because we greatly simplify a lot of nuances and details that are important in cartography, but we're trying to explain ways to work, assess and compare old maps with old maps and old maps with contemporary maps. And when old map examples that we mainly are working on in this project are from the Warsaw area. We have really good digital resources in Poland for this. And we're taking maps, for example, that I would have shown you, but now you can only get a guess sense from 1765, 1794, 1836. Those are what we want to focus on. The maps I'll be showing you today are mainly from 1915 and 1943. So there's 3 generalization operations, and I don't know how many are taught here these days. Is there a canonical list? How many? Okay. So we're obviously not including every type of operation, but I thought this would be an interesting point for the discussion here to talk about. I'll also talk about some examples that we're working with and how we're approaching this, because there's some programming that we have to do still to make this work. So basically, that's the gist that we want historians to walk away, that all maps have been generalized, and generalization changes maps. So the map isn't what was. If you get a map from 1765, it isn't what Warsaw was. It is showing what somebody has selected and somebody has generalized. And that's a really important point to start out with. Many of them know that, because historians are not ignorant of these things, but to understand how to work with this in the way that they're used to using hermeneutics to work through texts is really a big challenge for us in the larger project. But here it surfaces very quickly. We're basically telling them you can't reconstruct what's been generalized. In cartography, ICA talks about the art and science of cartography, and there's challenges in doing this. So we're focused on assessing the results of generalization. Why is that important? Well, in a cartographic sense, the alterations are changing the meaning. There's a relationship between geometry and semantics that's very complex, but it's there. For example, we don't get into with historians, but we tell them always, we have in cartography the theory of the cartographic line. And we say, this is, where you can start to see how our cartography understanding of a line goes far more beyond just the graphical representation of it, but there's an underlying relationship, not just to the data, not just to the phenomena, but to the cultural communication. And considering all those aspects is usually beyond the historian, but we say, even if you do it and we just show you some ways to helpfully assess the results of generalization, you'll be in a better position to judge how well that map is actually depicting those historical processes and events and people's lives in the way that you think they are. So we explain, of course, generalization and show them a few examples. This is, common fare for cartographers. I don't need to spend, I think, a lot of time on the differences between different scales and how items are generalized. Here is another example we use is we just took from old maps a section of the Vistula River near Warsaw and used a common beginning and end points and just looked at the lengths. This goes back to work from Julian Parkal from 1956, where he did something similar with the boundaries between countries and some countries in Europe with rivers, and found that with increasing scale, you had an increasing, the length of objects increased. Not proportionally, it was not idiosyncratic, but it was a very clear increase. So two countries could have very different lengths of the same boundary between them. And this is why this can be important, because we can use metrics to be able to not gain insights into the cultural aspects, but we can say there's differences, and by doing a comparative approach with interpretive historiographical research, we're able to open up, we hope, the cartographic resources of old maps for a better understanding of what they've changed and how they're representing the world. So here's where we explain generalization in one slide. There's no rules and no guidelines, we tell people, but we say it's a lot of discussion always around them, whether it's 12, 6, 9, or whatever number people come up with. We're just focusing on these three operations: elimination, simplification, and displacement. Because when we were looking through the literature that we have obviously in English, but in German and in Polish too, we consider too, then we just found these three seem to be really significant in every list. And these three seem to be the most relevant in terms of their impact on the geometry and therefore the semantics of the resulting generalization. Here's some examples. And this is for which I'm going to turn to those. You're always going to have on the left side the map from 1915 and from 1943. If for those of you in the room are good in German, Rob, yeah, they're both in German actually, because they were both done during German occupations of Warsaw. So the methodology that we were looking at developing is to basically take scans of the map that have been vectorized, classify by feature type, and then count the features, and then just do a comparison to say, how many features do you find of this type in map A, and how many do you find in type B? That would be combined with a visual possibility in the dashboard that we're looking to develop that would allow a historian or a person interested in this to look at this and to assess what specifically has been changed in addition to gaining that quantitative overview. We're interested in doing it at the feature level, not just overall, because we want to see if there's been certain types of features, that have been removed from one map and left in the other one, to see if there's certain types of features that have been left out. So some of the interesting discussions we've had so far, as you might see in the right map, it's the Adolf Hitler Platz, which by chance. That's, you can't really see the name of that space. That's the on the left map, but that's in Polish there. And that place, you might notice the building there seems to be really emphasized, but there's no label on it. That's because it was an important seat of the Wehrmacht and during the occupation of Warsaw during the Second World War. So they don't want to say Wehrmacht here. They're just being very discreet about that. Here's a number of things, our examples that we focus on are less complex, more benign, like you can see in the Castle Square that, that in 1915, they're showing a lot of trails or pathways that were there, and they've all disappeared in 1943. For what reason, we don't know. Is it because they were physically gone, or is it because the cartographers left them out? Don't know. On the other hand, in 1915, you find thin red lines that are showing between, you can see them sometimes peeking through behind the street names. And in the 1943 map, they're emphasizing the public transportation streetcar network that had been built between the wars and were more finished between the wars. For simplification, we're taking a similar approach with looking at rasterized maps and vectorized features, and then using computer graphics and techniques to be able to calculate shape metrics for individual features that we can find in both maps, and then to compare those differences and also to construct some ways to look by type at changes that have been made to find out if systematically there's a distortion in the way that simplification has been used in the representation. Here, in the example here, as it explains above, we have near the palace castle, we see the church symbol has been used in the 1943 map, whereas in the 1915 map, we just have the actual outline of the church that's there. The final version is, of course, displacement. That's the most complex, perhaps, from dressing and working with. Here we're looking at an example that we can visually see in the different maps between the movement of a railway that used to run along the shore and how it's been moved. And then that's rather complex because there's sheet level distortions that can introduce displacement effects similar to displacement. And then we would use shape metrics again for specific features, for specific objects that we can identify, and then use it, and then use this comparison at the end. The note is important here. We know that this is really going to need a lot of data preparation and analysis. And we've submitted another proposal to get some support to be able to do work along these lines, but we'll have to wait a few months on to hear if that's been successful. Otherwise, we'll continue on our meet to the best of our abilities. Now, obviously talking to you here, one of the issues is going to be like, well, what are the impacts? How do you assess them? And it's really complex. For this, we can go back to the automated generalization research, where they never really did a systematic analysis of the effects, the impacts of automated generalization, but the tools they developed can be used today for doing and revised to assess that. We're obviously going to have problems because the scan and then vectorization is a challenging process if anybody's ever done that here. And we're going to have to take a number of issues into account. So the odds are, for our purposes and what we're trying to do there, we're just going to take small areas and just do proofs of concept and say the bigger issue is still there. You need a lot of labor to be able to do this really in the detail that you probably want to make this the results meaningful for you. The shape metrics, the simplification, for example, I can just show the basic equations for that. This is from the existing cartography literature out of automated generalization on how to do the assessment. So that's quite straightforward to program. And then, but again, the data preparation is going to be the complex one. Obviously, the calculation of displacements is a bit more complicated. And here there's an interesting approach that was developed in Bader's dissertation at the University of Zurich in 2001, looking at the movement of a shape. So basically looking at not breaking down the linear elements that constitute the borders of a shape in terms of their relationship to each other geometrically. And looking at that, maybe going back to the dance example, then describing that in terms of mathematically the changes between the angles and seeing if in map A, those angles in the resulting measure are how different it is to the corresponding angles in map B. And then getting some insights that way into generalization, into the effects of generalization. This was done to make a vast leap forward in automated map generalization and its ability to handle complex curves like sinuous mountain pass roads or in urban areas where you have complex road layouts on hillsides where you need to preserve the relationship of road segments to each other. But with the distortion you have to introduce at scale, you need to have a reliable mathematical approach that's not going to just wipe everything out. Like you can do, oh, that was my favorite work example. Somebody came to me one day, I'm going to digress for a moment here, and said, I had this map and everything was there and it's all gone now. I said, well, what were you doing? He said, well, I had this map and it was a digitization of all our vegetation types for the area, but it didn't align with the road map. So we wanted to simplify it so that it would align and we wanted to move everything. So what did you do? And well, we used the function and arc. Now I'm really going to dig for some arc info that uses a fuzzy tolerance, a clean, I think was the name of the function. I don't know what it's called now. And then we are going to use the clean and we set the fuzzy tolerance to 1000. And this is a map that's in UTM, so it's 1000 meters. So he did afterwards, the map he said was just a square, a tiny square at the middle, because everything had with the fuzzy analysis had just been collapsed into one little tiny square. It's like, what do we do? We lost everything. So that was one of those moments when you realize, you're like, okay, having some cartography and GIS background really is important for working with a lot of these abilities you have now to wipe out your map for this person at least, or people who are not so versed in cartography or some of the computational geometry. And when we have to work on developing tools going back to interactions now that support the way that they're doing interpretive research. We just can't deliver a tool that takes input A, produces output B, and we say, you look at it and you'll know what's changed. We have to figure out different ways to do this because people are looking at this in a process and you basically need to like step them through. And that's what this part is more about for us in the development of a desktop. It's more about just dealing with the data, but also about finding ways to support this process of research rather than just producing a tool that takes input and gets a good output. It's not simple, as it says at the bottom there, but it's possible that we'll be able to do this in the time ahead of us. So let me just come to summary and outlook, because as I mentioned before, this is work that's ongoing. Where the graphical interactions may always be like exhibit interactions, no matter how disembodied we feel when we do things on the internet or what AR headset we're going to be using. But there's always a sense somehow of embodiment that's involved in this, and that geometric metrics are not going to lead to some magic solution, I think, for dealing with the interaction problem, but it can be helpful for improving our abilities to create better graphical means of communication that can support the richer, complex, cultural, and individual aspects of communication. So just a note again, happy to talk about generalization operations. Our focus on the 3 just reflects our sense of the significance. the outlook is, as I've mentioned a little bit while speaking now, that we're going to be developing a dashboard and to support iterative interpretive historical research. We have to first develop we'll use Python for it because I can program in Python and work with other people in Python to take some available image processing tools with the algorithms to integrate them into this process. And we're hoping that in September, we'll be able to show more empirical results from this project. So I'm going back to Europe next week, and hopefully we'll be working on it then. For that, I have to acknowledge the Polish National Agency for Academic Support and a lot of colleagues who've helped with a lot of discussions along the way and input. But Marta Kuzma, who I mentioned earlier on, who's been a key person with a very, very strong Polish cartography background, has been the key person for working on a lot of these things. And thanks to you for listening.
So we have perfectly time. So we have some time for questions. Feel free to ask in the room. Our traditional song is to let our students have. I'll moderate the chat. So Francis just field some questions.
Yeah. I'm going to move around and not getting necessarily let Francis go.
Good question. That's what we're starting. So I'm really interested in your work looking at geographic balance. So that was called geographic. And so my research is really about looking at analysis like a narrative lens. One of the things I think about is how paragraphs. So I was wondering if you encountered any sort of thought given to training sort of storytelling capacity of these like complex information and also people making exhibits as well. Were they designed to tell a particular story, or is it just sort of like an efficient way to bring attention?
Okay.
And Francis, if you can try to repeat the question, so sorry.
Yeah. So absolutely, no, I follow. So the question was, I'm going to paraphrase much of it, but was, have I found any examples of people using concepts of narration to talk about it? And the answer is yes and no. I'll say the no part first. People didn't think about narration in the way we use the term now. It's not as an active concept then. I mean, stories are what you read in Brothers Grimm. You didn't go to an exhibit to listen to that kind of story. You were moving away from that. So there's sort of this break where they're saying this old way of doing things we don't want to do anymore. But yes, they do. I can say right away that for that particular product, I've done archival work on it too. I've not been able to find any real archival material talking about how they produced this atlas. There's notes from Bayer. There's a text that points out things. There's some work that the art historian has found who's writing in Munich who wrote her PhD about this and now is going on and doing some more work on it for her habilitation. There's some fragments about that. What's fascinating about this atlas is the way it was received. There's like a stack. I mean, it's literally 2 inches of letters from the offices of Truman, from Churchill, from university professors saying how wonderful this atlas is from the middle of the 1950s. But there is zero in the archive when I went through it in Denver before COVID, then quickly, and I didn't have time to do it carefully. I didn't see anything about it. But he did a lot of other exhibit work. And there's an exhibit he did later, I don't remember the year, I think it was 1960, for the Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. And for that, there's a lot of notes. I mean, he's probably older and he's probably like, well, I should save some of this stuff and not just throw it out when I'm cleaning out the office every few years. But those notes are indicative of, how the concepts play out. And also what's important in those notes is his bickering with people from the Air Force about what to do in the exhibit and how to do it and how they change what they want. And you read this correspondence and you're just like, yeah, well, that's, now we have emails and but it's still the same kind of issues then. And I would say, though, this narrative concept, you have to look through the literature that's on design theory, and then you'll find more material that looks into how this developed in the 20th century and how we get to this concept of narration. Because narration, as powerful as it is, it can also be, as much as the tools they had back then, a tool that blinds us to other possibilities of doing things. So, yeah, I'm sorry I don't have a very good answer.
Oh, that was great.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, definitely.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Nice.
Ever seen questions? The question about
Yes.
also you're talking about the atlas. You're talking about kind of these bizarre images speaking to the interaction.
Yeah.
And it made me think of like political cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if that is something that like, is that like connections? I don't know what my question is. But
Yeah, I have to repeat it though now. So the question I'm going to try to answer is there a relationship between the approach that Bayer was taking with merging various graphic layers, I'll call them, to use a more modern term, in a single page of the atlas, something that you see is being used in political cartoons?
Yeah.
I haven't thought about it. It's basically, it's really complex what they're doing and how, I mean, because nowadays you have so much control, whether you're using Illustrator or InDesign, you have so much control over minutiae of the process and you can get things ready for print. At that time, they had to know exactly what kind of print process they were using because that would be completely different if they were using Intaglio at this print shop in New York City, or like that atlas, all those images I showed you before, all that, the page, one side of the page is printed in Italy. The other side is printed in the US at Rand McNally. So how do you that's like, I mean, I mean, Rock's laughing like, oh yeah, talking about coordinating some of the things he's been involved in. It's like, you can't imagine doing that in 1953 because it wasn't like you were going to send a message to the printer in Italy and expect them to respond in 2 days. It was, you know, if you got a response back in a month, that was phenomenal. So doing all this stuff, it just meant a very, very different level of, you know, connection and work that we often forget. But it often meant, too, that when they understood each other in the conversations that they had had over the years, they knew people's biases. They knew the print shop's strengths and weaknesses. So they were able to communicate with them about these things in advance and therefore really make some information project if you could have the funding. Now, what I didn't mention is this atlas is privately funded. This isn't, they're not selling these things, they're giving them away. They're still, I can tell you where some are in the US, but they're worth a lot of money now. And they are, so how do you organize that? You know, where does this play into? And then you've got to look at this atlas being something that's leading up to the Aspen Institute. And then you have to look at the institutional role of the Aspen Institute, not just today, but in the past, in post-World War United States policies of being a forum for the United States and the world to have this free and open intellectual exchange about what the post-World War order is going to look like and could look like, and how to bring together business, government, and other groups. So it's not just about an atlas. It's not just about, you know, the political cartoon. These people are thinking like, you know, how do we use these atlases to, I mean, it sounds a little bit like, what's that silly movie with Sandra Bullock? When I say the line, everybody will know. This is for world peace. No. What? You remember? I can't remember the name of the movie now. It's where she plays the undercover FBI agent. Yeah. No. Yeah. But I mean, that's a pop culture reference, but this was before that. And this is, you know, you have people that are thinking about this and they're thinking about how to use the corporate richness and, the position of the United States after World War II to basically change the way that we communicate and can do things globally. And that's where it's important also to understand this atlas. And so I don't know if there's any political cartoons based on it at that point or afterwards.
I think it was more conceptual idea of like these interactions of like kind of complex things beyond the words themselves.
Could be, but people are extremely creative, and there's a lot of parallel things going on. Like Bayer uses what I would call isotype figures in the atlas, but he never calls them that. And the people who were doing work with isotype in England, London at that point, they actually said, well, you're using isotope and you don't credit this work from Oscar Neurath and our group now, because he died in 1945. And no response. So there's also this borrowing liberally from each other. And, that was going on in a lot of ways, but there's also some parallel ways that things develop where people just don't know of each other. And they remember, you can't get on Wikipedia in 1953 and go, who did this, or search in Google. It's like to find these things out is next to impossible. I mean, some of us might even remember from our childhood, we're like, you wanted to find something out, well, you probably won't. You can spend, your life going through this. I can remember going through the journal collections over there in the main library here, and it's a totally different world now. It's a difference. Like that.
So I want to make sure that you get a chance to ask your question. To you, nothing in the chat.
The question is in the second part about the action on the list, because your requirements, experiments, it's more towards the individual operator and then the evaluation of something that's specific operator. I wonder, have you consider like, more flatly method to consider only sure that it's multiple organization, multiple operators, because recently we found that we'll apply like deep learning or AI approaches to those managing organization, or oftentimes it actually mimic to the generalization of readers, and we don't know how to better assess which specific operator was like you. Yeah, this might be also very problematic generalization assessment.
Yeah, it's a very important question. There's a lot of complex issues there. I should first repeat the question. I'll try to paraphrase it. And that is, in looking at, I've talked about individual readers, but what about multiple readers? And what about how the process of reading changes the way that generalization is conceptualized and biases that you can find in the algorithms? And the short answer is, we're working on some preliminary usability tests now, and in that we try to, basically use a Bayesian framework to see what learning effects are there. And we'll use randomized, what are they called again in English? The examples are randomized. So different groups see different, but we'll be categorizing by groups, so then we can see if different groups have different learning curves, and also if different backgrounds lead to different, I'll call it learning curves. And that's one's approach. The bigger issue, I think, is what I know from psychology, and that's confirmation bias, where you're going to have to account that people know something when they're coming in. They might not be able to tell you at that moment what it is they know, but it influences how, when they look at a map of Wisconsin, they know where Lake Superior is, Lake Michigan is, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois. And they might not tell you that at the beginning, but that influences, because they've done it, seen maps so many times, their ability to see things and to find things and to orientate themselves. And that's what we're interested in the generalization, but I'm not sure how to do that in the scope of what we're doing now, is to untangle this complexity of confirmation bias. We can try to account for it in the experimental design, but to address it is, I'm hoping to do another research. There's a research proposal plan to look into that for that reason. Thanks for the question. Yes, please.
Like for example, while you're carrying on your research, like did you anyway come across like the same map and in one map they have used transparency of attributes like maybe representing the underlying road or the drainage network within it, or the same map that will completely opaque.
Uh-huh.
Like how did you actually perform like analysis or features? Because like you use Python in image processing, how well does it pick up this transparency of attributes when on the scan maps?
That's a great question. I'm only going to be able to answer it in a few years. Because at this point we know that there's, oh, I'm sorry, I have to repeat the question first. So how are we using the Python imaging tools and how are we accounting for the complexity? Yeah, and right. Yeah, and we're basically at this point where we're doing prototypes. And so this question becomes relevant when we try to develop things into becoming more relevant. But since we'll be doing all of this work as open source, you might be the person who gets to answer your question.
Have you actually come across this kind of maps?
Oh yeah, all the time. I mean, I know from people who do political economic analysis of atlases or maps. There was recently a dissertation in the University of Erfurt in Germany. And it's basically because of the economic costs of producing maps. They're all the time duplicating these maps and reusing portions of the map and trying to save money by recycling, basically would be a modern term for it, what they've done. And it's for economic reasons.
Because I was like wondering, like when you see the work of Greenhoff maps, he uses transparency a lot while he uses like the pie charts when he describes different dam structures or like electricity showing demographics or so thinking like how does he use transparency when it comes
Oh yeah.
to compare maps?
No. I mean, and that's a whole level of analysis. I'll call it the semiotic analysis of it, where we're not going into, we're just separating it into features and saying, okay, let's compare it. That analysis is, that would be long-term, I think, because it's so complex, but there's so much potential in it. But it's when you look at the literature on semiotics, every attempt to try and systematize the semiotics without looking at the conceptualizations of the people doing the work with it has all ended up in interesting research, but little benefit. Say that, if I can be so blunt. So we're trying to do this differently and work with historians, which means that we won't be able to make any steps where we have an improvement on an algorithm. We'll basically produce an algorithm that does something, but because it's integrated in an interpretive research process, then it's just going to produce some modest changes. But that's, again, it's a different environment now, and I think it's a much better scientific environment to develop things, produce an open source version of it, produce also the executables so that people can download it if they don't know how to compile and set it up. But then to let other people take your question on, for example.
Yeah, I have one last question, selfish one. Because I want this recorded for the future. It's the material we teach that's similar to what we talk about first step.
Yeah.
We introduce it when we talk about replicating some of the past in base maps.
Okay. Yeah.
And I have a section where I talk about art deco in the US. And I go to constructivism.
Sure.
And then finish the Bauhaus. I call that all modernism. Sort of like, so when you're kind of doing words, what's the differences in visual style?
Oh, I'll look for an example because I can show you a wonderful article about a discussion about, it was from remember this, the question I have to repeat. Is this transition from Art Deco to modernism, and what's my take on that? And basically, in the 1920s, there was a German map. It was like a tourist map, or not a map, a poster, and they wanted to take this modern avant-garde poster and then use it in the U.S. And the people in the US said, you cannot, no way can you do this. Everybody will be offended by this. you have to bring it into this kind of visual trope to be able to use it in the US. And I think part of it is just in the US, not just in Wisconsin, there's a certain reticence about modernism and about the avant-garde and about Russian constructivism because it's so strongly associated with Bolshevism and communism later on, that it's just not known except outside of certain design circles. So for the mainstream, it was taboo almost. And so there you were stuck in the US. I wasn't there alive then, but I remember talking to people who were doing some design issues then, and it was like, no, we have to make a living. And if we do something like this, nobody's going to buy it. So we're not going to survive. So we have to do design not the way we want to, but the way that commerce is asking for it. So you end up with this catch-22, if that's a concept I can use here, where things don't evolve because the people are paying for it in the US capitalist economy and neoliberal economy now don't want changes in this. It's really, for me, interesting just looking at fonts when you're going. I was traveling the last months in the US, and the fonts here are so conservative. I mean, Helvetica, sure, everywhere. But after that, it's like, I haven't seen this font for 60 years. It's nice. It's like Adlai Stevenson and Eisenhower would have been using this kind of fonts for some of the text and some of the layouts for advertisements. It's just like, and it's so changed in Europe. I mean, but that's a common phenomenon. If you actually, for example, this is a side anecdote to that, but I think relevant. If you want to find out how English was spoken in England in the 17th, 18th century, come to the US. Because in every country that has been colonized, that has taken over a language from another European country, the language has changed in the country that was colonized. But in the colonized country, the language stops. And it's really much more the pronunciation in American English, the organization of sentences exactly. It's much closer to Elizabethan English here in the US than in Britain. So maybe that's true to some extent for graphic styles and cross-cultural issues. I think that's changing now with globalization, but how it's changing is not something that any of us can really comment on because we're in the middle of the flow, in the middle of those changes. But it'll be more in what happens in the years to come, where we've already seen a lot of change. But, as they say in the US, you ain't seen nothing yet. So I think there'll be a lot of dynamics in this area too in the graphics, which, it just seems like it's ripe for a change, like when Helvetica entered the US in the 1960s and 70s. Seems like it's ripe, but maybe it'll revert after some tumultuous events back to a new font type. And then everybody will say, Helvetica, that's so old-fashioned. Stay tuned.
The speaker, Francis, for
Thank you online too.
and currently after this, we have Sal coming it's busy drinks. So everyone, everybody part of that. It's just upstairs and the hall. I think that it's on the way, so
Okay. Thank you.